Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thanks to everyone who came out. This is an incredible showing of people here at the Tishman Auditorium at the New School, and to everyone watching at home on the live stream. My name is Rachel Rosenfeld, and I am the Associate Director of the Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism program, which is housed here at the New School in the New School for Social Research. It is a privilege to be here in celebration of Amy Goodman and David Goodman and Dennis Moynihan's best-selling book, Democracy Now!, 20 years covering the movements changing America. Before I say any more, I just want to recognize the work of our public programs team and the Nth Degree series, which is led by Jessica Haight-Manick. This event marks the finale of a year of programming of Nth Degree events, which has continued the New School's important legacy, century-long legacy. Phones, please. Of giving platform to progressive events where creative minds create change. I also want to thank this is actually just an elaborate stunt to get all of you turning your phones off. Okay, we got it, all right. I want to thank my senior department secretary, Rochelle Ram, who really organized this event. She's indispensable to us here at the New School, and to our Director of Communications, AJ Ehrenstein, who's made this special partnership between Democracy Now! And creative publishing possible. The New School tells two stories about itself. The most widely known focuses on the university in exile, as many of you know, which was founded in 1933 at the end of the Weimar era. It was a moment of great turbulence, of economic crisis, breakdown of civil society, and the rise of dictatorial personalities. At that time, the New School provided sanctuary for refugee scholars who had been persecuted for their religious and political views. And we have since established a strong legacy with the question of democracy at our center. Democratic theory and practice, the history and politics of social movements, a commitment to economic justice, and a striving for international peace. The other, less widely known story about the New School is its actual founding period, which was 1919. The New School was founded by a group of progressive scholars and intellectuals, very notably a group of Columbia professors who had been dismissed or resigned for failing to sign a loyalty oath to the United States. The question of democracy then, in 1919, as in the 1930s, as now, is what drives this institution of ours. But it is very specifically the dual principles of freedom of expression and the right to dissent that animates the New School at its core. Which is why 2 years ago, the New School introduced a graduate-level journalism program, Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism. Remember that one for later, Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism. It could not have come into being at a more pressing time, nor rooted in a more significant tradition than that of ours here at the New School. So back to Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism, or CPCJ, as we call it for short. It is a cause for much hand-wringing here in the branding departments of the New School, because it's a very awkward mouthful of a program. And as an administrator of that program, I'm asked on a near daily basis what CPCJ stands for. So let's all please let's all just... Thank you, Amy. I still don't let her take that call. Okay. All right, so we're all ready. Let's get it clear here, once and for all. CBCJ stands for Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism. Thank you. I am committed to that name because what those words stand for is precisely what I believe journalism programs and media organizations must commit to in our own moment of turbulence and unrest. So first, creative publishing. Among other things, it means embracing decentralization, not fighting it. Democracy Now!, for example, has reached countless hearts and minds as an independent, anti-corporate, multimedia platform which is broadcast on the internet and by over 1,400 radio stations worldwide. And critical journalism. I'm going to quote Amy Goodman here from an interview she actually gave a CBCJ student last semester. Amy said, "It is our job to cover power, not cover for power. It's our job to be the fourth estate, not for the state." She went on to say to my student, "Do the work, get out there, open the microphone to people who are not usually heard," which, by the way, is not a fringe minority or even a silent majority, but the silenced majority who are silenced by corporate media. This is why we have to take it back. On behalf of creative publishing and critical journalism, to that I say, hell yes. Thanks to everyone for being here, and please welcome David Goodman, an award-winning independent journalist, the best-selling author of 10 books, host of the public affairs radio show, The Vermont Conversation, and a contributing writer to Mother Jones.
So as we were running over here, racing to catch a cab, running late as always, Amy was saying, we hardly gave them any lead time for this. I don't know if anybody's going to come. So, Amy, I think a few people did hear about it. About 20 years ago, I guess it's 21 years ago now, my sister came home and announced to tell us the news of a new project she was doing. Amy had had a lot of projects. At that point, she at that time was the news director at WBAI. As we travel around the country, I usually have to explain that what BAI is, this legendary institution in New York City, but I think most of you know about it here. So she had been the news director at BAI. She'd been the host of a morning show called Wake Up Call. And but this was new and different. Pacifica was launching a daily grassroots global election show. They'd never done this before, and no one had done this before on a national scale. The idea was to use the presidential election of 1996. That was the re-election campaign of Bill Clinton, who was running against Bob Dole. Some of you may remember him, not the guy who does the Viagra ads now, but he was a senator from Kansas once. I think that was also Ross Perot was in that race. Anyway, so the idea was to use this race to go around the country and turn the cameras and the microphones around, not to focus on the voices of those from the corporate suites, but instead to bring out the voices from the streets, your voices. to shine a light on the movements, the change makers, the activists who are working all over the country every day on issues local, national, and global, but who so often have to shout to be heard, shouting from a protest, shouting from outside the halls of power, because no one lets them in to hand them a microphone to just speak in a calm voice about what the issues are. So this was going to be an experiment. It was going to last 8 months. The show would start in February, wrap up a day or two after Election Day. And she told us excitedly it was going to be called Democracy Now! Well, you know, as her brother, I felt like my job was to give her some unvarnished feedback. So I did. Democracy Now? That's what you're going to call a radio show? Nobody's going to listen to that. I mean, and she said, well, what do you think it should be called? And I said, you know, you have to fly under the radar. Just call it Conversations with Amy or something. And then people tune in, they have no idea what this is, and then bam, it just hit them. That's how you get people in. Well, we have learned many times in our family, something that you all by now know pretty well if you've listened to Democracy Now! Amy doesn't really listen to conventional wisdom, not even when it comes from her brother or her parents. So happily, she ignored us, our bad advice, and Democracy Now! Was born. But a funny thing happened after Election Day. The demand for this show was greater than it was even when it began. Now, why is that? Well, I think for that we really have to thank the corporate media for the huge void left in our knowledge and understanding of the forces behind what is going on in the world today. We saw that so clearly, for example, in the Iraq War, a war which was based on lies. And, you know, if you're going to be trying to sell something that's based on lies, you can't just stand on the steps of the White House and shout these things out. You need the largest, most well-endowed, richest media establishment on earth to act, unfortunately, not to challenge those lies, but to be a conveyor belt for the lies. And we saw the terrible consequences of what happens. The lies cost lives. So fast forward, and we describe in our earlier books a kind of propaganda two-step that occurs. You know, as they were rolling out the sales pitch for the Iraq War, and it was a sales pitch. It was actually orchestrated by Andy Card, was the chief of staff to Bush at the time. Card came from General Motors, and when asked, he famously said, you know, they launched this campaign in September of 2003. He famously said, you know, he was asked, why then? What was it about that date? He said, well, everybody knows you don't roll out a new product in August. The product was war, and they sold it quite well. And they sold it well because, as Dick Cheney explained, he was asked it was on the first Sunday of September. This was a carefully timed campaign. He warned that he had been secretly, you know, privately put out to the national security correspondent of the New York Times at that time, Judith Miller, this phrase, the smoking gun could be a mushroom cloud. So he appears on the Sunday talk shows, and he says this line, the smoking gun may be a mushroom cloud, but don't take it from me, take it from the New York Times. That was, in fact, the headline in the Times that morning. It was a hermetically sealed environment of propaganda in which they could count on the media to do exactly what they needed it to do. So fast forward to around 2015, and a guy who might in any other world be a cartoon character, a reality TV star, billionaire, misogynist, multiple wives, racist, xenophobe, all these things. But let's give Donald Trump credit for one thing. He understands our media better than the media understands our media. He knew that this toxic mix of name-calling and racism and misogyny and what have you would be irresistible in our media environment. And so it was. There was a study done putting a price tag on the fair market value of the free airtime that he was given in the primaries through the general election. This is the interactive part of the talk. Take a guess at how much free media he was given, the dollar value of it. 1 billion, 6 billion over here, okay. 2 billion, billions and billions, all right. So 6 billions, you're way too cynical, and 1 billion, you're really lowballing it. $5 billion was the value of the free airtime he was given. And of course you know that. You couldn't turn on the TV but any time in the last 2 years without seeing him spew all this stuff that he was spewing. What he was given was worth more than Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, who wasn't running for president, but he's in the news a lot. All 5 of them combined didn't get what one candidate, Donald Trump, got. Well, we know that, one of the things about being in Amy's family is we find out, the price of being independent, of speaking truth to power in this setting is high. Courage is not something that happens in journalism in hindsight. Courage is speaking up, speaking inconvenient truths when it matters. Nowadays it's hard to find anybody who says they supported the Iraq War back then, but if you wouldn't know that on the airwaves, it's like I wrote a book about apartheid South Africa. Nowadays, you go to South Africa, nobody supported apartheid. No, they were all anti-apartheid all along. So, it's speaking these things when it matters, and that has been a very uncomfortable place. I know this because I've been the recipient of the phone calls from the Indonesian embassy when they're trying to run her out of the country because she's reported on a massacre in East Timor where the Indonesian army using U.S. weapons killed hundreds of people, and Amy and her colleague Alan Nairn survived it, although Alan had his skull fractured as they swung their M16s at him. Or from the 2008 covering the Republican convention in Minnesota when Amy and the Democracy Now! Team was arrested, thrown to the ground, and there was an outcry, actually a lawsuit that Democracy Now! Won against the St. Paul police. And also the phone calls from a border post of what is now considered one of our most feared foreign enemies, Canada, where Amy was detained as she went in to go speak at the Vancouver Public Library about freedom of the press just before the Vancouver Winter Olympics. So yes, it's not comfortable speaking these things, and Amy will say more about the coverage, remarkable coverage that she and the Democracy Now! Team did from Standing Rock, North Dakota. And a little breaking news on that. Democracy Now! And Amy were just awarded the highest award of the Society for Professional Journalists for breaking news coverage for their coverage at Standing Rock. But to understand the significance of that, the previous winners of it in the last few years were CBS News, ABC News, CNN, the people with the helicopters, the 18-wheelers full of equipment, the, makeup trucks and the vans and stuff. Yeah, well, Democracy Now! Is there in its one rented car and a lot of intrepid journalists going out there, raising hell and getting the story. So... Well, so for those of you, and I hope it's everyone who tunes in, listens, watches to Democracy Now! Every day, you know how important this is. You know that Democracy Now! Has become the beating heart of a movement that now spans the globe. It is the place you go to find out that you are not crazy and you are not alone. So here is to at least 20 or 40 or however many more years that my wonderful sister can hang in there and keep bringing us this. And here is to the woman who I consider the most courageous and essential journalist in America today, my sister.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I thought I could trust that guy. But I want to thank David, my brother and co-author of our books together. Wonderful writer, committed journalist. I want to thank the Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism MA program here at the New School for sponsoring this. My niece, Ariel, who came from Philadelphia, and Hank Murad, a person I consider a close friend and family, for coming out today. And all of you, the whole community that represents independent, that is deeply committed to and cherishes independent media, because independent media is what will save us. David and I wrote this book called Static. And the reason we called it that is, even in this high-tech digital age with high-def television and digital radio, still all we ever get is static. That veil of distortions and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality. What we need is the media to give us the dictionary definition of static. Criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. And that's what I want to talk about today, those movements. And I also want to thank my colleagues at Democracy Now! Who've come out tonight, and all of them who are committed, this remarkable think tank of videographers, reporters, graphic designers, all of the people that make Democracy Now! Happen and have for 21 years. You know, we began on 9 stations in 1996, the only daily election show in public broadcasting. We're a 9-month project. We'd end after that election, whoever won. It was the second election of President Bill Clinton. We were wrapping up, but there was more demand for the show after than before. So more and more stations started to pick up Democracy Now! Okay, well, the next year we went down by a station, that's true. The Pennsylvania network that ran Democracy Now!, Temple University, Jazz FM, dumped us because we dared to air the voice of Mumia Abu-Jamal. Now, it wasn't our idea originally. I have to credit NPR for that. They recorded the commentaries of Mumia on death row, African-American journalist, former Black Panther. And they recorded these commentaries. The editor said it was some of the finest commentaries they'd ever heard on any issue. You know, when Mumia Abu-Jamal talks about what's happening, he doesn't talk about his own case. They were going to air them to great fanfare. The Fraternal Order of Police cracked down, pushed hard, launched a campaign against them, so they locked them away in a vault, which is where Democracy Now! Stepped into the void. And we felt this was our responsibility, to go to where the silence was. And so we went in and recorded a series of commentaries with the National Prison Project. And we started to air them. Mumia talks about the fact that so many young men in prison don't know their fathers, and he became this father and grandfather figure to so many when he couldn't be the father and grandfather to his own children. He talked about capital punishment is punishment for those without capital. And it was these kinds of commentaries. We began the first one, and the Society of Professional Journalists, they were supporting us, mainstream journalistic organization. We had a guest on that day. We got a lot of attention. New York Times and others covered us. And in the midst of the show, Jazz FM, Temple University, dumped the program. They said that the people who listened wanted more jazz. Suddenly, that morning. And this was, I took it as a great insult because I love jazz. I didn't think it was an either-or choice here. They also wrote to us, and they said it was inappropriate to air Mumia Abu-Jamal's voice. Well, I beg to differ. If you think about it, in broadcast in Pennsylvania, you almost never hear his voice. Now we have digital means of getting information out, and there are documentaries, but actually, if we just relied on broadcast, and they were trying to control that voice. They had a problem. I mean, there was big teach-ins and protests, but they had a problem because, well, they said that the listeners wanted more jazz suddenly. They had already put out their folio, their program guide, and it went out to all their listeners, and it said that Democracy Now! Was one of their most popular programs, and they were using it as a model for other shows. So somehow the truth seeps out. But, I think partly because we did this and we continue to run those commentaries, more and more stations started to pick us up. And then came the week of September 11th, the horror, the terror attacks, and the World Trade Center. We were the closest national broadcast to Ground Zero out of an old firehouse, which is now a community media center, our friends at DCTV, Downtown Community Television. And we went on our first station that week, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, public access in New York. They just asked if they could run the show as emergency broadcasting. And then the program just took off. TV stations around the country were saying, well, could we do this? And we started, I thought it was breaking news, so we had to send up those video cassettes overnight. It was video cassettes at the time. And the FedEx guys would come in soon. They had garbage bags filled with video cassettes. And when we would go on a public access station, the NPR station town would say, wait, can we run you? And then the PBS station would say, could we run you? And then globally, we were also working on the internet from the beginning. Necessity is the mother of invention. We couldn't afford the satellites. And so we perfected a way to send broadcast quality video through the internet. So today in Sweden and a number of cities, we broadcast many times a day on television, also on radio in South Africa and Japan, throughout Europe. Our headlines are available in Spanish and audio and transcript form from the 9 stations, then 8, 1996, 97. We're now broadcasting on over 1,400 public radio and television stations a day. With a station a week picking us up somewhere, and I think it's a real testament to the hunger for independent voices. Not that small circle of pundits that you get on all the media that know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. I really think the mainstream media is a misnomer. It is not mainstream. Because those who care about war and peace, those who care about the growing inequality in this country, racial, economic, social injustice, those who care about LGBTQ equality, people who care about climate change, the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority. Not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back. So, now, we have been on this amazing tour back and forth around the country. I was just in Seattle 2 nights ago at Seattle Town Hall. We came back here because we couldn't miss out on this wonderful event, and I'm headed back to Seattle in the morning. We'll go through Oregon, Washington, and California throughout the week. We began in Denver, Colorado, doing a big fundraiser for community media. It was public access TV and the big community radio network there. It was the new website, Colorado Independent for local news. It was at the Su Teatro Performing Arts Center, bringing together all the independent spaces. And by the way, I am so honored to be here at the new school, to be here in this auditorium, the sanctuary of dissent, to be working with McNally Jackson, which is a wonderful independent bookstore, these places are places where you can go to gain sustenance. And these are the places, like our precious WBAI in New York, 99.5 FM, part of the Pacifica radio network, that we must preserve so it not only survives but thrives. Just a quick point on Pacifica. You know, it began more than, close to 70 years ago in Berkeley, California, where we'll be doing an event on Sunday, founded by a man named Lou Hill. He was a war resister, came out of the detention camps and said, there's got to be a media outlet, not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. Not run by corporations, as George Gerbner, the late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, would say. Not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell, that are raising our children today. And so Pacifica was born. KPFA, the first station, in 49. KPFK, the second station, in Los Angeles in 59. Our station, WBAI, 99.5 FM, born in 1960. In its first year of operation here, WBAI was broadcasting a debate between James Baldwin, the great writer and activist, and Malcolm X over the effectiveness of nonviolent civil disobedience, the lunch counter sit-ins. WPFW in Washington just turned 40, born in 1977. And in Houston, the Petro Metro, KPFT went on the air in 1970. That's the Fab Five. KPFT, the only radio station in the country whose transmitter was blown up. It was one of the first weeks of operation. Arlo Guthrie was singing Alice's Restaurant, and the Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. And I thought Alice's Restaurant is a good song, but so anyway, they get back on their feet and they rebuild the transmitter. A few weeks later, the Klan straps 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter, blows it up again. Now it takes months to rebuild. It's January of 1971. Now the media is paying attention. They come in to cover this phoenix rising from the ashes. Arlo Guthrie comes to Houston to finish his song live on the air, and KPFT went on the air and has not stopped. I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles, but he said it was his proudest act. I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it is an elder of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota, or an uncle in Afghanistan, when you hear them speak, it changes something in you. You begin to understand where they're coming from. I didn't say agree. I mean, how often do we even agree with our family members? But you understand why they feel the way they do. It makes it a little less likely that you'll want to destroy them. It's that understanding that's the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it is wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take the media back. It really matters. I mean, think about how we learn about the rest of the world. You may know someone from another country, or you may be from another country, or most likely you're learning about it through the media. And even more important to our national security is people learning about us and how they're learning about us. In both ways, it has to be through something other than a corporate lens. It truly is a matter of life or death. When we cover war, we have to be brought to you by something other than the weapons manufacturers. When we cover climate change, we can't be brought to you by the oil, gas, coal, and nuclear companies. When we cover healthcare, we're not brought to you by the insurance industry and big pharma. We need independent media that tells the truth, or the many truths of people, and respects those truths. Now, I want to talk a little about what we're seeing in Washington today. There was a big evaluation done of President Trump the first 100 days, and I think that's extremely important, the dismantling of the regulatory state. Now, that sounds so bureaucratic, like, are you kidding? Is that what we're talking about? But we're talking about the air we breathe, the water we drink, the land we live on, where these are issues of national security. And very slowly, even despite all the daily scandals, that is all being dismantled. I mean, what we see in Washington is the rise of the oligarchy. And I'll talk a little about that later, from Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, Secretary of State, to, Scott Pruitt, the head of the EPA, who came out of Oklahoma, which never knew earthquakes. Now it's the land of quakes because of fracking. Sued the EPA 14 times. Governor Perry of Texas, who's the Secretary of Energy, who ran for president twice, bankrolled to the tune of $6 million by Kelsey Warren, the CEO of Energy Transfer Partners, which owns the Dakota Access Pipeline. And when Governor Perry stepped down as governor, right on the board he went of Energy Transfer Partners, only stepped down to become Secretary of Energy. This matters. These are very powerful positions, but there is a force more powerful, and it is all of you in this room and people all over the country. And it's not, a dream. People have been rising up, and these same 100 days, we have to look at the resistance that has risen up in a way we have not seen before. Right after Donald Trump was inaugurated, a great deal was made of his inaugural crowd size. He made a great deal of it. 180,000 people, by the way, is a very respectable crowd, except when the next day he saw the pictures of the comparison to President Obama's inaugural crowd 9 years before, right? His was 180,000, Donald Trump's, Obama's was 90% larger. It was 1.8 million. This infuriated Trump to the point where he said he had the largest inaugural crowd in history. But that obscured what happened the next day, just in Washington, then all over the country. 3 times the size of his crowd came out to Washington alone, and that was women marching with their allies. We went to Sundance after that because we covered the documentary track there. I saw Kerry Washington. She was so excited, of Scandal, because she'd just spoken at the LA March, 750,000 people there. And then in places like Montpelier in Vermont, where David lives, my brother, 20,000 people came out. They had to close off the interstate. They said the capital couldn't contain this many people. And we saw this in villages and hamlets and cities all over, not only the country. We live in a global community all over the world, because what we do is amplified many times over in the rest of the world. Take the issue of climate change. The effect we have as the historically largest greenhouse gas emitter on the world. We cover all the UN climate change conferences from 2009, Copenhagen, on to Cancun, Durban, South Africa, Doha, and then we were in Poland, and then Peru, and then Paris this year. We'll go to Bonn next year. Why do we do it? Not because of the people who are inside. You might say, why waste the fuel? It's the people outside, the thousands of people from the most targeted area, the people who are most vulnerable to climate change. Like when we were in Copenhagen in 2009, the 15-year-old boy who looked into our camera from the Maldives and said, "You are drowning my country." The people of sub-Saharan Africa who say, "You are cooking our continent." And they come, they're often arrested outside these climate summits, or they are beaten back, rarely allowed in, and yet what they have to say, people in this country must hear how our lifestyle is sustained. You know, we bring you the voices of people all over the world. And when we were in Durban, South Africa, something happened, a breach, and the people outside were invited in, the youth. And at the end of the UN Climate Summit that year, youth were invited in to address the vast body of bureaucrats, scientists, delegates, world leaders, and the youth chose as their leader a young woman named Anjali Appadurai, who came from College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine, where you get a degree in human ecology. And she stood up before this august body. Young people ringed the room. And she said, I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money? You've been negotiating all of my life. You've failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, and you've broken promises, but you've heard this all before. We're in Africa, she said, home to the communities on the front lines of climate change. The International Energy Agency tells us we have 5 years until the window to avoid irreversible climate change closes. The science tells us we have 5 years maximum. You're saying, give us 10. She said, the starkest betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition. Where's the courage in these rooms? Now's not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion. There is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, and to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top. 2011 was the year when the radical became reality, she said. And she ended by quoting Nelson Mandela, who said, it always seems impossible until it's done. And so she looked out on the world body and said, so distinguished delegates and governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now, get it done. And people actually applauded in the room, and the president of the COP, the Conference of Parties, which is the UN summit, said, on a purely personal note, I wonder why we let not speak half the world's population first in this conference, but only last. And the next year, I saw Anjali Appadurai in Doha, outside the summit, and I said, Anjali, are you coming in? She said, no, I've been banned. But change happens. And this movement, much more sophisticated than the rest of the world, there are plenty of debates around climate change, debates on what to do about it. In this country, the debates are, well, it's like if every time we talked about the round earth, we brought on someone from the Flat Earth Society for balance. And there is so much time to talk about it. On the networks, every 5 or 10 minutes, they're sharing weather, right? Severe weather, extreme weather, the Severe Weather Center. What about flashing another 2 words? Climate change, global warming, climate chaos, climate disruption, so you don't only figure out what to wear that day, but what we can do about it. If the meteorologists would finally speak what they know, they shouldn't be able to be called meteorologists if they are not going to talk about what is happening to the climate, how serious it is. I just flew back from Seattle. I was sitting next to a Norwegian scientist who had been up at the Arctic Circle Council conference, whose specialty is looking at the Black Plague, at the Black Death, right, of the Middle Ages, and how it's coming back with climate change and global warming. This is terrifying, and it's science. It is a fact. which is why we broadcast for 5 hours on Earth Day, April 22nd, from the March for Science in Washington. It was freezing, it was pouring rain, it was a downpour, but thousands came out. Then we broadcast the following Saturday, April 29th, for 5 hours from the People's Climate March. About 200,000 people came out in Washington alone for that. We went from the freezing downpour of April 22nd to the hottest April 29th in Washington, D.C. history, 7 days later. These issues matter, and the government can ensure that we can change the trajectory that we're on. Well, clearly, we have a government of climate deniers, not only denying the issue of climate change, but when it comes to the issue of human rights, we're entering terrifying territory. And that's what I want to turn to now. I told you about going to Denver, doing this big fundraiser for all the independent media, and the next day, this is just a few weeks ago, right before we flew out to British Columbia, I went to the Unitarian Church, because that's where Jeanette Visguera had taken refuge, taken sanctuary just this past February after Donald Trump became president. She was scared because Daniel Ramirez in Washington State had been arrested. She didn't know him personally, but he was a dreamer. He was legally allowed to work, live, and study in this country, and he'd been arrested. And she thought, if he was arrested, I don't have a chance. She actually has 4 children. She's been here for 20 years. Her older daughter in her 20s is a dreamer, is here under DACA, allowed to live and work and study here legally, and 3 American kids. And she's paid her taxes every year, law-abiding, lover of this country. But she knew, like 11 million undocumented people in this country who are so needed to perform the work, but when it comes to this administration, live in terror every day, and that makes us all less safe. Because if an undocumented immigrant has a crime committed against them, they're going to be afraid to call the police. And then someone is on the loose who is a danger to society, or a woman who's suffering domestic violence, terrified if she reports that she herself will be deported. So Jeanette goes into the church. We interviewed her in February when she went into the church. I was here in the studio. She was on Skype in the church. But now, 2 months later, I wanted to see how she's doing. How's her family doing? And when I walked in early on this Saturday morning, she said, "Don't think I just sit here. With all the support that everyone gives me here, like I have for years, I've worked for immigrants' rights from morning until night." And then her kids were waking up. They were coming out. Zuri is 6, and Roberto is 10. He is a feather of a boy. They all go to the Denver public schools, speak perfect English, and Zuri sat on her mother's lap as I conducted the interview, and then Roberto came out. And he had a poster that the teacher had made in his school for his mother. And it was a lithograph of her beautiful face. And it said at the bottom something like, "Keep families together." And they were selling this poster, and they were going to carry it at a Cesar Chavez march that day. Roberto and Zuri, but not Jeanette, because she couldn't leave the church, or she could be iced. She could be arrested. So as I interviewed Roberto, he kept his arm around his mother as he spoke. And he said, "We're going to go out on this march today, but my mother has to stay inside. So I am my mother's voice." Very beautiful. And what's amazing is she told me how many death threats she had gotten. I said, "So what gives you hope?" Because so many more people showed their support. Thousands of people have showed their support. And it made me think of the great writer Isabel Allende, who wrote House of the Spirits, who said, for every paramilitary thug out there, there are thousands of compañeros and compañeras who are there to help each other. That is what the hope is. The Denver police chief told Jeanette, she couldn't go to him, but he came to her, "I have your back. You call me if there's any problem with these death threats." The Denver mayor has expressed his support. The local congressman, Jared Polis, has expressed his support. we are seeing a level of resistance in this country that doesn't come from your typical places. I mean, Juan Gonzalez and I just went about, a month ago, 6 weeks ago, downtown Manhattan to a room not as big as this, but hundreds of people packed into it. They weren't your typical noble activists who go out on the streets and fight for all of our futures, but they were local city councilmen from all over the country, state legislators, mayors, and they were trying to figure out how to provide sanctuary to those who live in their cities, their towns, and their hamlets. It was truly astounding. And then they would go back to their communities like Gregorio Casar, the youngest elected member of the Austin City Council, and get arrested in the governor's office protesting the new legislation that is passing forbidding sanctuary cities. And then you have the sheriff, Hernandez, in Austin, a young woman who says no to the governor. Hank, I think we have to turn off our phones here. I'll turn off mine. This is truly amazing. The level of resistance at every sector of society. Don't assume because of the position someone holds what their point of view is. I have learned this over and over, and we need a media broad enough to express all of these views. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day. War and peace, life and death, and anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us and civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they're sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. Now, I told you that story about KPFT and how it was blown up by the Ku Klux Klan. That's a story of many decades ago. It's a story about history. I cannot believe that today we're actually talking about the Ku Klux Klan. And I mean, I do believe there is a reason they endorsed Donald Trump for president. David Duke also endorsed Donald Trump for president. The way over the years he rose in popularity among a certain sector of white nationalists and became known in this country because he was a leader of the birther movement. I mean, this astounding movement that said that President Obama could not be possibly from this country and that he was a secret Muslim. He was not born in this country, he said. Now, there are a lot of criticisms of President Obama. I mean, the expansion of the drone wars, he became the chief, even his allies call him the deporter-in-chief for deporting millions of Americans, millions of immigrants from this country, expanding the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, all of these issues. But not being a legitimate president of this country, obviously dog whistle politics to attract and to amplify hate in this country. This is what extended into the current presidency, Donald Trump issuing Muslim Ban 1 and Muslim Ban 2. But the response to it was so astounding. The thousands of people who came out to airports all over this country. In Dulles, a senator and a judge were roughed up by security. I mean, we haven't seen anything like this. So, on the first Muslim ban, President Trump says that refugees from 7 Muslim-majority countries cannot come into this country. And this ruling, this executive order, is stayed by a judge in Washington state, as Donald Trump referred to him, a so-called judge. Whether it is a judge or the FBI director, I don't think President Trump likes to be judged. Whether it is a judge, the FBI director, whether it is the media, which he calls the enemy of the people. Any level of criticism he wants to vilify, and it is destabilizing this country, but also strengthening movements. So he calls the first judge a so-called judge. Then he tries to issue the second Muslim ban, barring refugees from 6 majority Muslim nations. And the Attorney General, the chief of the Justice Department, Jeff Sessions, goes on right-wing radio last week and says, that a judge in Hawaii stayed the second Muslim ban. Attorney General Sessions says, how is it possible that a man on an island in the Pacific can stop the President of the United States? We're engaged in a nationwide civics lesson, from kindergartners, 5th graders, everyone in this country learning about the co-equal branches of government. I do think President Trump and Jeff Sessions should participate in this civic session. It is so important. But the level of protest, and Donald Trump immediately said about all these protests, who's paying them? He's always trying to get to this. Because he projects. When he ran for president, he first announced he paid actors to be at Trump Tower to applaud him. I bumped into an activist at the People's Climate March. He said, I'm a professional protester, but I'm doing this today pro bono. But the level of activism that we have seen, that has so warmed the hearts of so many, like Jeanette Vizquera. So she's in the church. We broadcast that interview we do with Jeanette and Roberto the next day. We come back to New York. And the next day, Time magazine announces its, 100 most important people in the world. Jeanette Vizquera is among them. So she holds a news conference. She can't go outside, so she's inside the church, and she holds up her 2016 tax returns, and she encourages people to take a look, and she also encourages the President of the United States to show his. So she couldn't go to the Time Gala here in New York, where John Legend, his video went viral with some choice words for the president. So the community in Denver held a Time Gala for her in the church. And we showed images of it on Democracy Now! And the next morning, last Wednesday, ICE can't get her because she's in this church, she's being protected. They arrested Arturo Hernandez Garcia. He's a Denver man who's lived in this country for well over 10 years, has 2 kids and a wife, works with his brother-in-law in their tile business. I got to know Arturo 2 years ago because he took refuge in the same Unitarian church under the Obama years, afraid he would be arrested, until the Department of Homeland Security gave him a letter that said, you are not a priority for deportation. And he felt that he wanted to act in good faith, so he stepped outside with this letter, and he wanted to encourage people, immigrants, to come out of the shadows. And so he has worked for the next 2.5 years, continuing to work with his brother-in-law in their tile business, until that Wednesday when he was taken. They couldn't take Jeanette, so people pretty much feel they went after someone they could take. American Friends Service Committee, which work with both, we talked to Jennifer Piper on Democracy Now!, a young woman who called ICE and immediately said, what are you doing? You know Arturo has this letter that says he's not a priority for deportation. And ICE responded to him, we live in a new era, they said. And they said, we no longer have priorities, which is an unusual way to put it. So he was taken. And then we were speaking in Burlington, Vermont, in a Unitarian church. And I look over as we're talking, and on the side are 2 people that I know, Zuli Palacios and Kike Bakasar. They're 2 well-known immigrants' rights activists who work with migrant justice in Vermont, that's working with the dairy farmers and with the immigrants who work on the dairy farms for, ice cream companies like Ben & Jerry's to ensure that they're paid fairly. The reason I recognize them is they were on Democracy Now! Because a few weeks before they were picked up. They were picked up by ICE, they were held for close to 2 weeks, but there was such tremendous outcry that they were finally released. Then, just a few days ago, Juan was interviewing Karime Andukar on Democracy Now!, a young immigrants' rights activist, a student at Rutgers, where Juan teaches, who runs on DocU Rutgers. She's DACA, she's protected, and suddenly she gets a call from ICE, you come in. It's a few days ago. You come in for a nice interview, completely unexpected. I mean, everyone rose up, including, I think, Senator Booker was there, every level of government saying, you are not going to take her. So the day after Juan interviewed her, we broadcast the interview, and that was the time she was being brought into ICE. Okay, she was allowed to come out, and Zuli and Kike were released. Jeanette in the church and Arturo in detention, until we just learned this morning that there was a stay issued to Jeanette and Arturo being released, and she can come out of the church. These are so important. Now, you know, most people don't hear that people are released. They get the message, and it sends this chill through the communities of millions of people. Are they hunting down immigrants' rights activists right now? These are the most high-profile people. That's why others are so afraid. But it made me think about Juan's speech when he was inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame. You know, Juan is such a fine reporter, such an important voice, not only in New York, but all over the world. He retired as the Daily News columnist last year. There were so many parties we were on another community media tour. I kept getting these texts, pictures of people leaving and coming into Juan's, I don't know how many retirement parties. There was Governor Cuomo, he was leaving, Mayor de Blasio was coming in. They won't be together because they hate each other. And Senator Schumer, and I'm saying, wait a second. We're supposed to be holding those of power accountable. Why are they all feting you on? But then I realized they wanted to go and see with their own eyes that this man was finally leaving and would no longer be dogging them. So Juan retired from there, stays with his other DN, not the Daily News, but Democracy Now! He's teaching at Rutgers, continuing to do reporting. And he's inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame last year with, Charlie Rose and Leslie Stahl and New York Times' Max Frankel and others. He's the first Latino journalist to be inducted. So, you know, all the big networks and newspapers had tables. It was Midtown Manhattan. Democracy Now! Had 2 tables, more than anyone else. We were all there to celebrate Juan. And Juan looked out on the audience and he said, talking about his quarter of a century as a columnist, I figured my modest contribution would be not writing about outcast neighborhoods, but from them, not simply to entertain, but to change, not after the fact, but before it, when coverage could still make a difference. He said, I've tried to use as many of my columns as possible to probe the injustices visited upon the powerless. Yes, the rich and famous are also victims on occasion, but they have so many politicians, lobbyists, lawyers, gossip columnists, and even editorial writers ready to jump to their defense that they'll always do fine without my help. He said, I prefer the desperate unknown reader who comes to me because he or she has gone everywhere else and no one will listen. More often than not, I come across unexpected gems, human beings whose tragedies illuminate the landscape and whose courage hopefully inspires the reader to believe that there is indeed some greater good served by a free press than just chronicling or influencing the ouster of one group of politicians by another. And I think that very much embodies the sentiment and the feeling and the mission of Democracy Now! Over these 21 years, which is why a small team of us from Democracy Now! Went to North Dakota this past Labor Day. Now, just let me tell you briefly about this epic struggle. Last April 1st, a woman named LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux, invited people onto her property. She opened it to the resistance along the Cannonball River. Resistance, that was resistance to the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline owned by Energy Transfer Partners that would snake its way from taking fracked oil from the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota through South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, and then hook up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. And the Native Americans said no. Well, they weren't the only ones who said no. The people of Bismarck, North Dakota, they said no, the capital. And so it wasn't put near them. The people of Mandan, North Dakota, where the jail and the courthouse is, they said no. And the company respected it. This private oil company that would change the terrain, the landscape, the air, the water of so many, yes, they didn't put it near Mandan. And the Native Americans, the Standing Rock Sioux, said no, they weren't so lucky. And so people stood up. First, scores came to the Sacred Stone Camp, as she called it, and then hundreds and soon thousands were gathering. And so more and more resistance camps were established, like the Red Warrior Camp. And this was going on for months, and people started to get arrested, and they were particularly concerned about the Dakota Access Pipeline tunneling under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America, that would provide water to some 17 million people downstream. They were protecting the water not only for themselves, but for everyone. That's why they call themselves not protesters, but water protectors. And so this resistance grew. It was the largest unification of Native American tribes this country has seen in decades. Native Americans from Latin America, from the United States, First Nations from Canada, all gathering there with non-Native allies. So we went there Labor Day weekend. That was even late. We were covering it before, but weren't there on the ground. And we went the week that a judge who was going to be ruling on the case the next week asked the Standing Rock Sioux for a map. He said, if you say that this is destroying your sacred ground, show me a map where your burial sites are. And they did. And they drew a map for him. He gave it over to Dakota Access Pipeline. And he was going to decide the next week. We got there on Friday. We started covering the protests. I mean, they were amazing. You have hundreds of people walking on these back prairie roads of North Dakota. They often started with a water ceremony. And some of the Native elders, particularly the women, would carry glasses of water. They would be met by a fully militarized sheriff's department. I mean, a rural sheriff's department with MRAPs and tanks? How is this possible? They would be holding out the water. They would say, this is for you, not just for us. We're doing this for your children, not just for ours. They would be hit with pepper spray, with tear gas, with rubber bullets, with the full force of this department. And they would often say, the Native Americans, I mean, you're protecting the Dakota Access Pipeline. What about us? What about protecting us? Now, you know that scene of a militarized police department from Ferguson, for example. And the media rightly went there. And you saw, I mean, that summer, when an 18-year-old African-American teenager named Michael Brown lay baking in the sun after he was shot dead by a white police officer, Darren Wilson, baking in the sun, his dead corpse for over 4.5 hours, of course there was an uprising. And they were met by a fully militarized, not only police department of Ferguson, but all the police departments around them. This is recycling in America today. You take the military hardware from Afghanistan and Iraq, and you give it to the police departments of the United States. You know, we just had Norm Stamper in our studio, former police chief of Seattle, Washington. Juan and I were there for the Battle of Seattle in 1999. It's when we first did a TV broadcast. And you know what happened then. People were protesting the World Trade Organization, a supranational organization that could overturn the laws of democratically elected legislatures, and tens of thousands of people came out. You had union activists, you had teachers, you had high schoolers, you had farmers, doctors, nurses, all deeply concerned about subverting a democratic society, and they were met by the full force of the Seattle Police Department. It's a police riot. I mean, Seattle, the largest export city in our country, had never seen anything like that. They ran out of tear gas. They had to go to other states. They were hitting the protesters with these rubber bullets, you know, rubber-coated steel bullets is what we should say, and they hurt and they injured. And they went to other states to get more weaponry and came back. They arrested hundreds of people. Afterwards, Norm Stamper was ousted, the police chief, as he should have been. Norm Stamper now says it was the worst mistake of his life. He said, when a police department like his was so militarized, you can't help but see everyone in front of you as the enemy. And only afterwards he realized these were our kids, they were our librarians, they were our nurses and our doctors, and he said, I'm hitting them with the full force of our police department. He is a major spokesperson now for police reform in this country. So let me go back. And one other thing, I talked about unionists coming together, environmentalists. I can't be here at the New School without commenting that the NLRB ruled last summer that student workers have the right to organize. And students unionized last December at Columbia. Last week, they voted to unionize here, and I hope that the university will withdraw its objections and allow the votes to be counted. It's very important that all rights are respected, and especially coming out of the brave dissident tradition that the New School came out of, the remarkable history that it has. I know it will be honorable in this case. But you look at those kinds of protests, you look at how they are responded to, and we go back to North Dakota. So we covered these protests, and then on Saturday of Labor Day weekend, we were covering what we thought would be a sort of routine ceremony. There were many ceremonies there where Native Americans were going to that place that they laid out the map that showed the burial sites. And they wanted to plant their native flags there. They didn't think the pipeline company would be excavating because it was a holiday weekend. And when they got there, they saw bulldozers churning up the very places they had designated. And they believed that the pipeline company took the map they had drawn, leapfrogged over the areas they were excavating, and went right to the sites that they had designated, so that when the judge ruled the following week, the facts on the ground would be changed. It would be a moot point. And they were furious. They were horrified to see this. And they came up on the property. First it was women with children. Then more and more people came from the resistance camps. Scores of people came, then hundreds of people came. We were just filming. I was there with my brilliant producer colleague, Laura Gottesdiener, and our videographer, producer, John Hamilton, and my co-author and colleague at Democracy Now!, Dennis Moynihan. That was our team. So we're filming on the grounds. And people are standing up in front of the bulldozers. I can't describe how brave this is. These massive machines that are churning the earth, but how terrifying it is. I could only think back to March 16th, 2003, 3 days before the US invasion of Iraq in a different part of the Middle East, in Gaza, in Rafah. And a young American college student from Evergreen College in Washington State, Rachel Corrie, who was part of the International Solidarity Movement, who went to Rafah. She befriended a Palestinian family, a Palestinian pharmacist and his family, and Israeli military bulldozers came to demolish his home. And she and other activists donned those orange fluorescent vests that construction workers wear. And they stood in front of these bulldozers. And Rachel Corrie was crushed to death. And that's all I could think of as I saw people standing in front of these bulldozers. But this time they succeeded. This time the Native Americans prevailed and the bulldozers pulled back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They started moving backwards. It was then that the Dakota Access Pipeline guards unleashed attack dogs on the Native Americans. Horrifying. We just kept filming. I mean, we were filming people who were bitten, who were bleeding, who were injured. The dogs, even some of the dogs, pulled back, and they would throw them into the crowd, and they would bite their way out of it. We filmed a dog with its mouth and nose dripping with Native American blood. Ultimately, the Native Americans pushed the bulldozers and the guards, everyone back. They receded. It was Winona LaDuke that day, who we interviewed, great indigenous rights activist leader from the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, who, she pitched her teepee at the Red Warrior Camp, and it's got endangered animals all painted on the teepee. And she said, Governor Dalrymple, that was the governor of North Dakota, Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama. This is not 1965. We are through. That night, we posted the video of the attack dogs and the resistance on Facebook. Within 48 hours, there were 14 million views on Facebook. Now, let me say, this is the year of the election, 2016, that this is all happening in. Do you think one of the, I don't call them journalists, media personalities, who moderated the debates, asked a presidential candidate about climate change, let alone about this historic unification of Native American tribes, but about climate change itself? Not one question. The media will say, well, people aren't interested in this, and, they're selling products. It's just the news hole between the advertisements. Really, they're not interested. 14 million views is pretty astounding. So we came back to New York, continuing to broadcast Democracy Now! The judge was going to rule the following Friday. President Obama was in Asia that week, a historic trip to Laos, and his last action in Laos was to hold a democracy forum for young Asians, and they came from all over Asia. And the last question, a young Malaysian woman raised her hand, and she said, President Obama, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline? She asked a question that no American journalist had publicly asked President Obama. This young Malaysian student who came to Laos to question the President of the to learn from the President of the United States about democracy. It was a democracy forum. She asked the question about Apple. And he actually held forth and was very eloquent about the oppression of Native Americans over centuries. And then he did respond. He said, I'd have to get back to my team on that, specifically on the Dakota Access Pipeline. He came back to the United States that week before the judge ruled, and reportedly he saw the video of the dogs. It wasn't lost on the first African-American president, their significance. On Thursday, Governor Dalrymple called out the National Guard. It did not look good for the Native Americans in preparation for the decision on Friday. And the authorities did one other thing quietly. They issued an arrest warrant for me. I didn't know this at the time. So Friday at about 5 o'clock, the judge rules, routing of the tribe, totally against the tribe. The Justice Department lawyers about to pop their champagne corks. They had prevailed over the tribe. Not 15 minutes later, a 3-agency, unprecedented letter from Justice. The Justice Department lawyers had just won, but higher up at Justice, from the Army Corps of Engineers and from the Department of Interior was issued, clearly coordinated by the White House. We're slowing down. We're not just going to grant the final permit to dig under the Missouri River until we find out if Native Americans had input, until we find out if there was an environmental impact statement. I mean, the Native Americans are suffering from whiplash now. Worst decision, and then this amazing decision, and they don't, you have to sort of make sense of this. So that day, Friday, my colleague Nermeen Sheikh and I at Democracy Now! Headed up to Canada. We weren't fleeing. We were invited by the Toronto International Film Festival because a film was premiering about the great muckraking journalist I.F. Stone. He said to young journalists, if you're going to remember 2 words, remember governments lie. And if you can remember 3, remember all governments lie. And that's the name of the documentary. It's really good. It tells his history. And it talks about independent media organizations today, like Democracy Now!, like Matt Taibbi at Rolling Stone. So Matt came up also, and we all went up to Canada. And I thought it was important. A few days after we were in North Dakota, people in Canada care about First Nations, to talk about what we had just seen. So that's what we did after the movie. And the next day, we were invited to the University of Toronto, and we were giving a talk there. And in the middle of my talk, I got a text. And it said, you're under arrest. No, it said something like, there is an arrest warrant for you. So I was nervously looking down at my phone, And I was thinking, okay, this must be a scam. But I also have to be speaking at the same time. I was in the middle of my talk. And I'm going, this cannot be serious. But then I see it's a North Dakota number. And it turns out it was from a North Dakota lawyer. And I didn't know if this is real or not, but I better take it seriously. Like, if there's an arrest warrant for you, you're not necessarily picked right up. But if you have an encounter with police or FBI or maybe border agents, and they see an arrest warrant in the system, you will be taken. And I'm thinking, okay, I have to go back over the border. So how am I going to do this? So I didn't want to say I was going to the airport. I certainly didn't want to say this had happened. So I just said, could someone call me a cab? And I raced to the airport. And I thought if I could get there before the arrest warrant did, maybe I could. I mean, could they really just say I can't come back home? But I was able to. Came back into New York. And I didn't take it personally. I really did think this arrest warrant was a message to all journalists: do not come to North Dakota, which is why exactly we all had to go back to North Dakota. So a few weeks later, in October, the resistance is growing. Hundreds of people have been arrested. We return to North Dakota. I want to call the bluff of the authorities. I want to let independent young journalists know if they want to go to North Dakota, they don't have the resources to go to jail. They don't have an institution backing them up. This really matters, this chilling of free speech and the free press. And I wanted to let them know you don't have to get a record when you put things on the record. So we flew back, and as we landed in Bismarck, the prosecutor announces he's dropping the charges against me. Oh, but he would up new charges against me. He was charging me with riot, for which I faced a year in jail. Riot? I'm a one-woman riot? So I said to my North Dakota lawyer, not that I had one before, I don't understand. What's going to happen now? Are they just going to arrest me now at the airport? And he said, no. They're going to arraign you on Monday at 1:30. It was Friday, Monday. So that gave us 3 days to cover the protest. And we did. But I also asked, so now what happens? It's just an automatic arraignment. There's no human being that intervenes between now and the arraignment. He said, oh, well, the judge signs off on it. It's just a seal. He just stamps it, and it goes on. But he's not actually exercising discretion. He signs off on everything. So essentially, he gets involved after when it's a court case or whatever. So I said, oh, there's a human being. There's a judge who's going to make a decision here. He says, it's not a decision. 100%, they just sign off on these charges. You will be arraigned, and then we'll go from there. What's the judge's name? So we issued a press release, and we talked about the judge who would be making a decision as to whether to sign off on the charges that would lead to my arraignment. And needless to say, he got a lot of attention that weekend as we were covering the protests. And on Monday morning, well, the show must go on, and we had to broadcast Democracy Now!, and we were in North Dakota. So we brought in a satellite truck from Minneapolis, and we broadcast in front of the Mandan jail and courthouse, where I would have to turn myself in. So we broadcast from church property across the street. Our backdrop was the courthouse, the jail, and the 10 Commandments in between. And we started our show. And we interviewed Dave Archambault, who is the chair of the Standing Rock Sioux, the 45th chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux. Like Donald Trump is the 45th president of the United States. Dave Archambault, 45th chair of the Standing Rock Sioux, elected by the people of Standing Rock. And as he sat there on our set, I said, have you ever been arrested before? And he said, yeah, once. I got arrested protesting, doing civil disobedience just a few months ago. And I said, what were you charged with? He said, low-level misdemeanor. And I said, what happened? He said, oh, I was strip searched. I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. We interviewed Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle. She's the pediatrician of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. She cares about the kids. And so she was one of the first to be arrested. She cares about kids' health. Low-level misdemeanor. And I said, what happened to you? And she said, I was strip searched, I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. How much humiliation can a people take? And then they're put in the Mandan jail, And they are held by guards who voted against this pipeline, who are against this pipeline. They're being imprisoned in a city that said no to the pipeline. And here they are filling up the jails. When I was one time at the airport in North Dakota, a guy came up to me, and I was reading a magazine. He said, "I know who you are." And I said, "Well, who are you?" And he said, "I was one of the guards. I was one of the guards there that Labor Day weekend." I said, "Oh, did you unleash the attack dogs?" And he said, "No, you have to understand. Dakota Access Pipeline brought in different security companies. We did not know this other company would be there." Our report led to an investigation by the North Dakota Inspection Board that found it was illegal use of dogs. They were unlicensed. They came from a kennel in Ohio. But he said, "We had nothing to do with that, but I do understand," he said. "I do get it. When we sick dogs on them, after massacring them for hundreds of years, I understand why they're angry at us." You know, never assume what a person thinks based on their position. So after our broadcast that Monday morning, now the tension is increasing. More and more Native Americans are coming to show solidarity, perform ceremonies. The hours are coming towards 1:30, and I get a call from North Dakota Public Radio, a guy who's been there forever, who knows all the players, and he says, "The judge is not going to sign off on the charges against you. You're not going to be arraigned." This is what happens when the media spotlight shines in the right direction. And it wasn't just me, mind you. The Native Americans who were going to court that day, charged with misdemeanor and felony charges, many of them had their charges dropped. I mean, all of the media was paying attention. I mean, when a journalist is about to be arrested, so the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, it was a homepage of BBC, Al Jazeera, Vogue magazine was covering this. I have to spiff up my hat. And it mattered. For Native Americans, you know, it is the decision of whether the media acts as the sword or the shield. I am all for reality television, but the right kind that is showing reality of people on the ground. So I will just now move forward from October to December. December 5th, President Obama issued the final, the 3-agency letter that said they weren't moving ahead. Huge victory for the tribe. That they would not grant the permit for going under the Missouri River. They'd talk about rerouting, possibly not moving forward. This was all going to be worked out until Donald Trump was elected president, and one of his first executive orders said they would grant the permit for the Dakota Access Pipeline to drill below the Missouri River and revive the Keystone XL that had been defeated years ago by mass resistance. Yes, the oligarchy in Washington, from Rex Tillerson, head of Secretary of State, to Perry, to Scott Pruitt. These are mighty forces. But the resistance still is growing. At the People's Climate March, so many Native Americans, many from Standing Rock, said no oil has flowed through that oil pipeline. Yes, they've built it yet. And they are leading an international divestment campaign that is targeting banks like Wells Fargo and Bank of America and Chase, all those that support the Dakota Access Pipeline. And they are showing the underpinning of a fossil fuel economy that goes well beyond the Dakota Access Pipeline. I just want to end with these 2 points. The fossil fuel economy and what we are protecting, or the government is protecting in this country, is intimately connected to the wars that are waged abroad. You know, President Trump is suffering the lowest popularity ratings of any president in modern history. But that can also be very frightening, because when a president suffers this kind of anger, this kind of lack of support, he is going to look to deflect attention, particularly abroad. That is the easiest way to do it. I have to say the media has stood up. They found their backbone to a certain extent. I mean, certainly, I've been amazed. I don't even like to say this publicly. Why doesn't Donald Trump lay off the media for like 3 days? They will wrap their arms around them, as they so often do around the establishment, but he is punching them so hard that they are standing up. And they are talking about The media being essential to the functioning of a democratic society, sounding a little like democracy now. It's quite exhilarating. Except when it comes to war. We saw it back in 2003, US invades Iraq. 6 weeks before, Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, gives his push for war at the UN. FAIR does a study of the 4 major nightly newscasts, ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS NewsHour, 2 weeks around Colin Powell's speech. There were 393 interviews done around war, when half the population was for, half the population against war. 393 interviews, only 3 were with anti-war leaders. 3 of almost 400. That's not a mainstream media, that's an extreme media beating the drums for war. And so you move forward to 2017. Donald Trump okays an attack in Yemen that kills over 30 women and children in Yemen and a US Navy SEAL. When the SEAL's body was brought back to Dover, President Trump went. The SEAL's father went. He refused to shake President Obama's hand, refused to meet the president, so enraged that his son, why had his son died, he said. And then you move forward to the US attack on the Syrian military airbase that the Syrian military would use the next day, 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles, right, made by Raytheon. Did Donald Trump do it just to enrich himself? We know from last documents he has investments in Raytheon. And some of you might say, well, that's not quite fair. Well, we don't know unless we can see this. We can't figure out what his foreign policy is based on. Is it just based on enhancing himself and his family? And it's not enough to just say his family. It's his business partners. They are his family. So that when he calls the Turkish president, Erdogan, to congratulate him on pushing through this referendum that most European nations condemned vociferously, that grants the Turkish president dictatorial powers, allowing him to reign for how many more years? He is condemned by so many, and President Trump actually calls him to congratulate him? Is that because there are twin Trump towers in Istanbul? Yes, this is why it's very important to see the finances of the Trump family. We have to know what is the rationale for his actions abroad and at home. And then he drops the largest non-nuclear bomb in the history of the world on Afghanistan in his first 2 months of his presidency. It was developed under President Bush. He didn't dare drop it. President Obama didn't dare drop it. And in a few weeks, President Trump drops this bomb. The Pentagon dubbed it the mother of all bombs, the MOAB, the massive ordnance air blast that has a radius of 1 mile, the blast. It was at these times, the dropping of the MOAB, the bombing of the Syrian airbase, that the media started talking about Donald Trump becoming president. The media circles the wagons around the White House under a Democratic or Republican administration when the US bombs other countries. We need a media that stands apart, that is not a party to the parties. There's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the US Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. So, I just want to end back in World War II, where Pacifica began, but not here in Germany. A brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl, they weren't Jewish, they were German Christians, but they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? And together with their professor and other students and workers, they decided to form the White Rose Collective. They decided to put out a series of pamphlets so that the Germans would never be able to say, we didn't know. They published a series of 6 pamphlets. On one of those pamphlets were written the words, "We will not be silent." They had them distributed everywhere, under cover of darkness, in alleyways, marketplaces, schoolyards. And then Hans and Sophie and their professor were captured. They were charged They were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy Now! Thank you very much.